It wasn't until the night I poured the tea down the sink that I realized just how close I'd come to disappearing. For months, I thought the exhaustion was mine, the blank spaces in my memory, the fog, the dreams that felt more like warnings. I blamed stress. But that night, I faked it. I lay there, pretending to be unconscious, while he moved like a ghost through the apartment. He opened my laptop, plugged in a USB, photographed my passport, my will, my bank records. I didn't blink, didn't breathe. He whispered over me before slipping out of the room. "Sleep tight, everything's going according to plan." I wasn't his wife anymore. I was a mark. There was a time I believed Michael was the best thing that had ever happened to me. We met in Chicago during a networking event I almost skipped. I was 28, newly promoted to a financial analyst position at a private equity firm, still unsure if I truly belonged at the big kids table. Michael was different from anyone I dated, charming without trying, clever without arrogance, and genuinely curious about my work. We talked for hours that night, about market volatility, about art, about life. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. Our relationship moved fast, but it never felt rushed. Within months, we moved into a loft together, just blocks away from the Riverwalk. He surprised me with dinner when I worked late, left notes in my planner, knew when to offer advice and when to just listen. Everyone called us power couple material, and for a while we were. When I got an offer from a London firm, a dream job with international exposure and a salary that could change our future, I was ready to take it. But Michael had just started a new role with a major investment bank, and the idea of uprooting our life felt unfair. "We'll get another chance," he said, his hand in mine. "We build here, together." So I stayed. I didn't resent it, not then. Michael always made me feel like his partner in every sense. We talked strategy about our finances, supported each other's goals. He encouraged me to apply for a senior manager track, even coached me for interviews. When I didn't get it the first time, he took me out for sushi and reminded me of everything I brought to the table. Weekends were ours. We explored farmers markets, read side by side in bed, made plans for our future. We joked about raising kids who could debate tax reform at the dinner table. Even on rough days, there was this quiet rhythm between us, like a team with its own language. On our 5th anniversary, he planned a getaway to northern Michigan, a cabin by the lake, no cell service, just us. I remember lying on the dock beside him, watching stars shimmer above the black water, and thinking, this is it. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. He wasn't just my husband, he was my home. Or so I thought. Looking back, there were so many little moments that felt like love at its purest. The night I pulled 3 consecutive all-nighters for a quarterly report, Michael stayed up with me, brewing coffee and reviewing charts even though he had work at 7. When I got the flu and refused to slow down, he called my boss, pretending to be my assistant, and declared me medically benched, then spent the day making soup and watching old sitcoms with me. He celebrated my wins like they were his own. When I finally landed a major client that had slipped through our firm's fingers for years, he popped a bottle of champagne at breakfast. To the closer of deals and breaker of glass ceilings, he toasted. But he also carried me through losses. The miscarriage we never told anyone about, the layoff scare that had me crying in the shower, the slow drift of a few friendships I couldn't salvage once my schedule swallowed me whole. Michael was there, quietly, reliably there. That's why when the little compromises started giving up my gym class to accommodate his schedule, missing happy hours to cook dinner when he worked late, I didn't flinch. Relationships were built on give and take, and I had already taken so much. When we finally got married, it was a modest ceremony in our backyard, just close friends, string lights, and a playlist we'd made together. I remember his vows. "You are my favorite witness to all the versions of myself I'm trying to become." I cried through the whole thing. After the wedding, we settled into married life easily. He handled groceries, I handled bills. He fixed things around the house, I managed our budget. It was ordinary, yes, but beautifully so, and any doubts I ever had about turning down London faded every time I came home and saw him there, waiting with that crooked smile and open arms. If someone had told me then what he would become, I would have laughed in disbelief. Because I didn't just love him. I trusted him with everything. Even myself. It started with the tiredness. Not the kind that sleep could fix. This was a deep, bone-hollow fatigue that clung to me no matter how long I rested. I'd wake up groggy, stumble through the day in a fog, then crash on the couch before dinner, only to repeat the cycle again. At first, I blamed work. Maybe I'd pushed too hard, maybe it was burnout. But then came the mistakes. The missed deadlines. Miscalculated reports I could have done in my sleep a year ago. One morning, I called a client by the wrong name on a video call twice. My boss pulled me aside after the meeting, his brow furrowed. "Everything all right, Sophie?" he asked gently. I nodded, forcing a smile I no longer had the energy to mean. And it wasn't just work. I began forgetting where I parked my car, left my phone in the fridge, spent 10 minutes standing in the grocery store, trying to remember what I was supposed to buy. My mind, once sharp and organized, was turning against me. Michael didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and just didn't care. He stopped asking how my day was. His patience wore thin over the smallest things. A pan left in the sink would earn a sharp sigh. A dinner 10 minutes late? A comment about priorities? I found myself apologizing constantly for being slow, for forgetting things, for existing in a way that no longer pleased him. And then there was the tea. Every night, without fail, he brought me a cup. "Chamomile with honey, just like you like it," he'd say, setting it on the nightstand with a kiss to my forehead. It became a ritual, one he never missed, even when we argued, even when I said I wasn't thirsty. He insisted. "You need to relax," he'd murmur. "Let me take care of you." At first, I found it sweet, thoughtful, but then I noticed something strange. On the nights I drank the tea, I didn't just fall asleep. I blacked out. It was like someone turned off the lights in my brain. No dreams, no tossing or turning, just sudden unconsciousness. And I'd wake up hours later feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My head throbbed, my limbs heavy. Once, I tried skipping the tea to see if it made a difference. That night, I slept restlessly, but at least I remembered dreaming. I didn't feel as foggy the next morning. But when I told Michael, he brushed it off. "You're just stressed," he said. "Your body's adjusting. Give it time." He grew more controlling, slowly, almost imperceptibly. He started managing our finances alone, said he'd simplify things. I stopped having access to our savings account. He criticized my spending, even on small things like lunch with coworkers. "You don't need to be going out so much," he said. "Why don't you eat at home?" He frowned when I wanted to visit friends, made offhand comments about certain people being a bad influence or not really supportive of our marriage. Eventually, I stopped reaching out. It was easier that way. Even my clothes became a point of contention. "Why are you dressing up?" he'd ask when I wore anything other than sweatpants. "It's just dinner." Compliments turned into sarcasm. "Looking for attention," he once said when I wore lipstick to a meeting. The apartment, once cozy and warm, started to feel like a cage. My world had shrunk to the four walls of our home, my office, and the commute in between. And every night, waiting for me like clockwork, was that cup of tea. It sat there, fragrant and innocent-looking. And yet I began to dread it. Because it wasn't just tea anymore. It was silence, control, a sedative in more ways than one. I began to question myself. Was I overreacting? Was I imagining it all? Maybe I was just tired, really tired, and Michael was doing his best to help. I even tried keeping a journal, hoping to track the patterns, see if there was a logical explanation. But each night bled into the next, and the pages stayed blank more often than not. My thoughts scattered too quickly to catch. Emily, my best friend since college, noticed the change. "You okay?" she asked one Saturday over brunch, her eyes scanning my face. "You look off." I hesitated, then said, "Just tired, works a lot." She didn't look convinced. "You're sure it's just work?" I nodded, because what else could I say? That my husband had become a stranger? That I was scared of herbal tea? I wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. Instead, I went home that night and drank the tea, and once again, the world disappeared. The night everything cracked open, it started like all the others with tea. But this time, I was ready. I waited until Michael turned his back, humming to himself as he wiped down the counter. Then, with careful hands and a pounding heart, I poured the contents of my cup into the kitchen plant. I even tilted the cup slightly back toward my lips as I returned to the living room, mimicking a lazy sip. My face was a mask, my body a stage. He watched me from the corner of his eye. "You seem tired," he said softly. "Just a long day," I murmured. And then, I pretended to fade. I curled into the couch, tucked under the blanket, and let my breathing deepen into a steady rhythm. My eyelids fluttered closed, but not fully. I left just enough of a slit to see the outline of him moving, his footsteps deliberate and light. Michael waited a few minutes. Then, satisfied, he crossed the room and opened my laptop. At first, I thought maybe he was checking something, emails maybe, or bills, but his movements were too quick, too focused. He wasn't reading, he was extracting. He plugged in a flash drive and began copying folders from my desktop. I watched the little light blink on the device, flashing like a metronome. Then came the phone. He photographed documents I'd scanned, my passport, birth certificate, tax filings. He opened tabs on my bank's website, entered passwords with ease, downloaded statements, transaction histories, loan applications. My blood turned to ice. And he wasn't just stealing files, he was preparing a loan application in my name. A loan I had never discussed, never authorized. My fingers curled into the blanket, nails digging into flesh. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as my husband committed betrayal in real time. This wasn't forgetfulness, it wasn't stress. This was strategy. And then he opened another folder, one I didn't recognize. Inside were photos of him with another woman. Her arms around his waist, their smiles too intimate for friendship, beach photos, dinners, selfies in hotel rooms. In one, they kissed, her hands tangled in his hair, his wedding ring glaring in the frame like a cruel joke. I knew her, Lena, one of his colleagues. My breath caught. I must have made a sound, because he paused, glancing over his shoulder. I stilled completely, no movement, no twitch. He went back to work. I waited until the printer started worrying until he was distracted. Then, I slipped my phone from beneath the blanket and texted Emily. Urgency. Please call me. Don't respond, just call. 5 minutes later, when he finally retreated to the bedroom, I crept into the hallway and locked myself in the bathroom. Hands shaking, I answered her call. Lucy, Emily's voice was tight with concern. I explained everything in a whisper, the tea, the fatigue, the gaps in memory, and what I'd just witnessed. Her silence was deafening. Then, you need to listen to me very carefully. I whispered. There are sedatives that dissolve in hot liquids, fast-acting. They can cause confusion, memory loss, intense fatigue, especially over prolonged use. Do you think he's... I think it fits everything you've described. I think he's drugging you. Tears welled in my eyes. I didn't want to believe it. You have to stop drinking the tea, document everything, photos, timestamps, anything you can get, and tomorrow, you're going to the doctor and getting blood work. Understood? I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Yes. And Sophie? Yeah. This man is not your husband anymore. He's a threat. Do not confront him alone. Promise me. I promise. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of 7 years pressing down on me like wet cement. Every memory, every moment of kindness, now twisted into a performance. I wasn't his partner. I was his target. By morning, I'd made a plan. I called in sick to work, found a lawyer Friedrich Muller recommended by one of my clients, booked an emergency consultation. By noon, I was sitting in his office, documents clutched in a shaking hand. He's trying to take everything, I told Friedrich. Not if we stop him first, he said. Back at home, Michael acted normal, too normal. He kissed my cheek, handed me tea I didn't drink, asked if I wanted to plan a trip. I played along, nodded, smiled. But inside me something had shifted. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was awake. That night, I kept my phone hidden in my robe pocket, and when Michael finally fell asleep on the couch, I returned to my laptop. My hands were trembling, but I had to see it for myself again. What he'd touched, what he'd taken. The browser history confirmed it. Loan sites, identity verification portals, email drafts with Lena. Some messages had subject lines like final steps before wire and Spain property listing. My stomach dropped. Spain. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to vanish with everything we'd built, with my name buried in debt and Lena waiting on the other side. The full extent of his betrayal didn't hit all at once. It came in waves. The fake concern, the tea, the way he'd stopped touching me gently, the manipulation of our accounts, the way he silenced my world piece by piece until I forgot what clarity even felt like. Emily stayed on the phone with me through the night. She offered to come, to pack a bag and help me leave right then. But I needed more. I needed proof, strategy, backup. With Friedrich now involved, I wasn't just escaping, I was going to take back what was mine. I copied everything I could to a fresh drive, photos, statements, screenshots of emails. I took pictures of the printer tray, the USB, the timestamps. I documented it all. By morning, I had a folder labeled War. Because that's what it had become. A war for my life, my name, my future. And I was done playing nice. The days that followed were a blur of pain, disbelief, and exhaustion. On a pilot. eating only when Emily forced me, sleeping in short, haunted bursts on her couch. My body was present, but my mind spun in endless circles, replaying everything. His voice, his touch, the way he used to look at me, had any of it been real? I couldn't stop the questions. Was there a moment, just one, when he truly loved me? Or had I been nothing but a convenience, a stepping stone, a resource to be drained? Each time I closed my eyes, I saw him hovering over my laptop, his face half lit by the screen, so calm, so focused, as if destroying me was just another task on his to-do list. I cried until my chest ached, until there was nothing left but a dull emptiness, and then the anger came. Not just at him, at myself. For being blind, for giving up London, for believing in forever with someone who saw me as a mark. I remembered all the times I put him first, sacrificed weekends, passed on promotions, bit my tongue during arguments because he had a hard day. I gave, and gave, and gave. And he was taking still. "You're allowed to be angry," Emily said one night, as I sat curled on her floor, knees drawn to my chest. "It's not just anger," I whispered, "it's grief." "Of course it is," she said. "You're mourning someone who never existed the way you thought." That broke something in me. Because she was right. The Michael I loved was a ghost, a projection I'd built from bits of truth and 1,000 acts of trust. He never deserved the pedestal I placed him on. And yet some part of me still searched for him in the quiet moments, a muscle memory of love that hadn't caught up to reality. I'd reach for my phone to text him a joke. I'd think, Michael would know how to fix this. Then remember. He was the thing I needed fixing from. My world had fractured into before and after. Before, I was a wife, a partner, a believer in love. After, I didn't know yet. But Emily kept me anchored. She made lists, called lawyers, took me to the clinic for tests and blood work. She fed me, forced me to shower, reminded me to breathe, and when I woke up crying in the middle of the night, she just sat with me, quiet, steady there. "You're not crazy," she said once, as I spiraled over whether I'd missed something, whether this was my fault. "You were manipulated, you were drugged, you were deceived. None of this is on you." But it felt like it was. Like I'd let it happen by being too trusting, too soft, too eager to see the best in someone who never deserved it. I found myself rereading old messages between me and Michael, looking for signs. Maybe he'd slipped, maybe I'd been warned and just didn't listen. I started dreaming again, fractured, uneasy dreams filled with doors I couldn't open, voices I couldn't identify. Once, I saw Michael standing at the edge of a cliff, smiling, while I dangled from the edge, fingers bleeding. I woke up gasping, heart hammering against my ribs. That morning, Emily made coffee and slid a notebook across the table. "What's this?" I asked, voice hoarse. "Your life. Start writing it back." I stared at the blank pages for a long time. Then I picked up the pen. The first words were hard. They scratched their way out like splintered speeches in raw. I wrote about how I met Michael, about the first time he made me laugh so hard I cried, about the night he held me during a panic attack, whispering, "I've got you." I wrote about our wedding, the cabin trip, the stupid inside jokes that made no sense to anyone but us. Then I wrote about the tea. The sleep. The silence. It poured out like blood from a wound I hadn't dared touch. Line after line of truth, laid bare. I didn't know what I was hoping to find in those pages. Clarity, maybe, or a map out of this wreckage. What I found was pain, but also power. Writing became my ritual, my way of remembering who I was before the fog. The more I wrote, the more I saw the pattern, the slow dismantling of my identity, cloaked in care. And with each page, my guilt shrank a little. I wasn't to blame. He was. That afternoon, Emily read over my shoulder. She didn't say much, just placed a hand on mine and nodded. "You're getting her back," she said, "the woman you were." "I want her to be stronger this time," I replied. "You already are." Starting over didn't happen in a clean, triumphant sweep. It happened quietly, in a series of deliberate steps, some small, some monumental. After the night everything shattered, I stayed at Emily's place. At first it was survival. She gave me a bed, a toothbrush, space to breathe. I had nothing but a duffel bag and a broken sense of self, but slowly, her apartment became a kind of sanctuary. The mismatched furniture, the smell of old books, the soft hum of the radiator, it was safety. Friedrich, my lawyer, moved quickly. We froze all shared bank accounts. He walked me through paperwork that would block Michael from accessing credit in my name. We made lists, accounts to secure, emails to change, subscriptions to cancel. I updated my passwords with long, impossible strings of characters stored in a new manager app. I ordered a new phone, registered a private P.O. box, and opened fresh bank accounts. Each step restored a piece of control I hadn't realized I'd lost. And that control, it felt like air. Emily helped me create a filing system, organizing every scrap of evidence, photos, receipts, copies of messages, even timestamps from that night. We hid backups in multiple locations. She was relentless and methodical, the kind of ally I never knew I needed. But beyond logistics, there was healing to do. One morning, Emily found me staring blankly at a sketchbook she'd left by the window. I hadn't drawn in years, not since Michael told me it was a waste of time. That morning, something in me stirred. I picked up a pencil and drew a window, then a coffee cup, then a hand. I didn't stop. Drawing became my lifeline. In that little living room, surrounded by forgotten pencils and graphite smudges, I remembered who I was. Before Michael, before the fog, I started waking up early just to draw in the silence. At Friedrich's urging, I began preparing for the legal battle ahead. It would be complicated, dividing assets, proving financial misconduct, but I wasn't afraid. I had documentation, I had allies. Most importantly, I had clarity. And clarity was more powerful than rage. I started reclaiming other things too. I cooked meals from recipes my mom taught me. I played music Michael hated but I loved. I took walks alone, without asking permission. I dyed my hair a darker shade just because I wanted to. Bit by bit, the Sophie I remembered came into focus. One evening, Emily looked at me from across the kitchen table and said, "You don't flinch when your phone buzzes anymore." She was right. Michael still tried to reach me, texts, calls, even emails pretending to be from his office, but I didn't engage. I didn't need to. His power over me had been severed the moment I chose truth. And I chose it every day. My sketchbook began to fill with bold lines, sharper shapes. I painted one night my first watercolor in almost a decade. It was messy and imperfect and entirely mine. That night I slept soundly. Not because I was healed, but because I was healing. This wasn't the end of the story. There was still court, still fear, still memories that caught me off guard. But I wasn't standing still anymore. I was rebuilding, not the old life, but something better. Something mine. A few weeks in, Friedrich recommended a support group, women who'd survived financial and emotional abuse. I was hesitant at first. The idea of speaking my pain aloud to strangers terrified me, but I went. The first night, I just listened. Stories echoed through the room. A woman whose husband drained her retirement fund, another whose partner had forged her signature on loans, one who'd been gaslit into believing she was unstable for years. As I sat there, heart pounding, I realized something. I wasn't alone. When it was my turn, I told them about the tea. About the slow poisoning, the isolation, the files copied in the dark. And they listened. They didn't pity me. They didn't interrupt. They nodded with recognition, with quiet fury, with the fierce kind of solidarity that comes from knowing the same pain. I walked out lighter. Stronger. After that night, I started journaling again. Not just about Michael, but about me. What I wanted next. What scared me. What thrilled me. I wrote about taking a weekend trip alone to Dresden, where I sketched riverside cafes and sat through a thunderstorm wrapped in a stranger's umbrella. I wrote about the day I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months, when Emily and I burned a dinner recipe and ordered pizza instead. These were not victories Michael could see or take from me. They were mine. And for the first time in a long time, so was my future. The day of the confrontation didn't come with a storm or cinematic thunder. It came with a calendar notification, court filing 9 o'clock Iowa. Sophie stood in the courthouse lobby, spine straight, breath steady. She wore a navy suit she hadn't touched in years, a sharp contrast to the woman who once curled into herself beneath Michael's shadow. Beside her, Friedrich flipped through his binder, calm, methodical. Emily stood on Sophie's other side, her hand a steady weight on Sophie's shoulder. Across the room, Michael arrived. He looked thinner, not in a way that evoked sympathy, but like a man who had lost control of a game he thought he'd already won. His eyes scanned for Sophie, and when they landed on her, something in his posture shifted. Gone was the smug confidence. In its place, unease. Sophie didn't look away. She didn't need to. Inside the courtroom, everything unfolded with a quiet precision. Friedrich presented a clear chronological record of Michael's access to Sophie's accounts, the forged loan applications, the late-night file thefts. Sophie had documented it all. The USB files, the photos, the bank alerts, even a security camera feed from a cafe showing Michael accessing Sophie's account via public Wi-Fi. Something Friedrich uncovered with the help of a forensic investigator. Ms. Bennett, the judge said, turning to Sophie after Friedrich's presentation, "Do you feel safe at this time?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sophie replied, her voice calm, "because I took steps to make myself safe." Michael's lawyer tried to object, tried to redirect, but the facts were undeniable. The forged signature on the loan matched a previous document Michael had signed, proving he'd copied it. His phone records aligned with the file transfers, his own emails recovered from a shared cloud backup, contained damning references to clear her out before the quarter ends. The room went still. Michael's expression cracked. "This is a mistake," he muttered to the judge. "She's exaggerating. I would never hurt her." But no one was listening to excuses anymore. Sophie didn't flinch. The judge approved an immediate injunction blocking any further financial activity under her name and opening a formal investigation into Michael's actions. Friedrich filed for divorce proceedings on the grounds of fraud and emotional abuse, with a motion to freeze joint property and contest Michael's claims to shared assets. The moment Sophie would remember wasn't legal. It came in the hallway after. Michael caught up with her outside the courtroom. His voice was low, urgent, like old times. "Sophie, come on. This doesn't have to go this far." She turned, expression unyielding. "It's already gone farther than it ever should have." His mask faltered. "You're ruining me." "No," she said. "You did that all by yourself." Then she walked away, shoulders squared, heels echoing like punctuation marks on marble. In the following weeks, Michael tried to reach her again, through mutual friends, through emails, even a pathetic bouquet left at Emily's door. Sophie ignored them all. She had no intention of giving him a stage. Instead, she focused on the next steps. With Friedrich's guidance, she submitted formal complaints to the bank and credit bureau. The fraudulent loan was rescinded before it ever reached approval. She filed for a restraining order, granted swiftly given the evidence. And word spread. Colleagues who once admired Michael began to pull back. Clients questioned his integrity. One by one, his veneer of respectability cracked. The man who once claimed control now scrambled to explain, to repair, to regain ground. But Sophie had already won where it mattered most. Not in the courtroom, but in herself. She no longer woke in fear, no longer second-guessed her instincts. She spoke in meetings with quiet authority, earned a speaking invitation at an international finance forum, and was even approached to illustrate a finance book with her sketches, blending her two worlds. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. She never spoke to Michael again, not because she couldn't, but because she had nothing left to say. He had silenced her once. But now her silence was power. And it spoke louder than any of his apologies ever could. The press eventually caught wind of the case: financial fraud, emotional manipulation, identity theft within a seemingly perfect marriage. A journalist contacted Friedrich for comment, and while Sophie declined to speak directly, she agreed to let him share parts of her story anonymously. What mattered wasn't shaming Michael, it was shining a light on how easily this kind of manipulation could happen behind closed doors. The story sparked a wave of responses online. Women reached out to Friedrich's office. Survivors shared their own stories. Sophie created a private blog under a pseudonym, detailing her recovery, not in sensational detail but with honesty and intention. Her words became a resource, a quiet force for change. Professionally, she thrived. The promotion she'd once feared slipping from her grasp was now a reality. She led projects with composure, even mentored younger analysts going through their own rough patches. People listened when she spoke, not because of what she'd endured, but because of the strength she exuded. Michael's legal woes worsened. The investigation expanded to include prior loans and questionable transactions from his firm. Lena, the woman he'd planned to flee with, testified under subpoena, confirming Sophie's account and admitting she'd been manipulated as well. It became clear Michael hadn't just tried to destroy Sophie, he'd built a career on deception. Facing mounting evidence, he accepted a deal: probation, financial restitution, and the forfeiture of his claim on all joint assets. He walked away disgraced. Sophie walked away whole. The final hearing came in early spring. The judge ruled in Sophie's favor on all counts: divorce finalized, financial protection secured, restraining order extended. Outside the courtroom, Friedrich shook her hand with quiet pride. Emily hugged her, whispering, "You did it." Sophie smiled. "No, we did it." Because healing was never meant to be solitary. And justice, when rooted in truth, didn't just punish the guilty, it freed the silenced. Justice didn't come with flashing headlines or a final courtroom verdict. It came slowly, then all at once. When Lena testified, the dam broke. Emails between her and Michael surfaced. Flirtations, yes, but also cold, calculated plans. She admitted Michael had promised her a life of luxury funded by Sophie's accounts. The court didn't need much more. Michael's employer launched their own internal investigation, and within days, he was suspended. 2 weeks later, he was fired for cause. News spread through the financial district like wildfire. The once slavered investment strategist had become a cautionary tale, an emblem of greed, deceit, and downfall. His name was scrubbed from the company's website. Former colleagues deleted LinkedIn endorsements. Invitations dried up. Even Lena disappeared, reportedly left the country under a different name, having realized she was just another pawn in Michael's game. Michael tried damage control, a carefully worded clarification post, reaching out to friends for character references, but no one stood by him. The man who once orchestrated betrayal in shadows now stood exposed in daylight. And no one rushed to offer shelter. Months passed. Sophie moved forward with grace, her life rebuilt not in reaction to Michael but in affirmation of her own identity. New routines, new joys. A new art series, titled Reclamation, gained quiet popularity online. Then, one brisk autumn afternoon, she stopped by a quiet cafe in Kreuzberg. She ordered her coffee, found a corner seat by the window, and pulled out her sketch pad. Halfway through sketching a father and daughter sharing a pastry, she looked up and froze. Michael. He stood near the counter, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. His once polished suit now hung loose, rumpled. His hair was longer, unkempt. He hadn't seen her yet. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now flicked nervously around the room. And then, they met hers. Recognition sparked. Regret followed. He took a step forward, lips parting, something like hope flickering in his gaunt expression. Sophie didn't flinch. She closed her sketch pad, took one last sip of coffee, and stood. Without a word, without a glance back, she walked past him, her footsteps steady, her spine unbent. Behind her, Michael stood frozen. And that silence, her refusal to acknowledge him, was the most devastating sentence of all. He had once tried to erase her, but now he had become invisible. And Sophie? She was untouchable. Later that evening, Emily asked her how it felt. "In him again," she said. "Was it hard?" Sophie thought for a moment. No, not hard, just final. She didn't feel pity, or anger, or triumph. She felt peace. That was the true ending, not vengeance, but freedom from the need for it. A few weeks later, she received a letter from her old bank. It confirmed that Michael had attempted another withdrawal months ago, after the court ruling, but was blocked due to the permanent fraud alert on her account. He hadn't stopped trying, even as everything fell apart. But it didn't matter anymore. He had lost everything. And she had everything she needed: her safety, her voice, her future. She returned to her art studio the next morning and stood in front of a half-finished canvas. The strokes were bold, confident, bursting with color. She dipped her brush into cobalt blue and added a sweeping arc to the horizon. Behind her was a chapter closed. Before her, endless space to create. And this time, no. That night, Sophie lit a candle by her window, a quiet ritual she'd started months ago. Not for Michael. For herself. Each flame a reminder: she had survived, she had healed, and she had chosen her own ending. Sophie no longer measured her life in before Michael and after Michael. She measured it in mornings. The quiet ones, where the only sound was the kettle whistling in her new kitchen. The joyful ones, filled with paint-streaked canvases and half-burned toast. The difficult ones, too, when the past pulled at her like an anchor, but even then she knew how to steady herself. She had learned to trust herself again. It didn't happen all at once. There were nights when her heart pounded at the sound of the doorbell, mornings when she still checked her bank account twice out of habit. But each day she woke up without fear was a small victory. One she'd earned. Her new job came 6 months after the final court ruling, a consulting role with an international firm specializing in corporate ethics and fraud prevention. "You bring more than skill," the hiring director told her. "You bring lived resilience." Sophie flourished in that role. She spoke at conferences, she led workshops on emotional manipulation in finance, she trained managers on recognizing the signs. Her name, once nearly tied to scandal, became associated with strength, clarity, and integrity. But it wasn't just about work. Her friendships deepened. She spent long weekends hiking with Emily and quiet evenings cooking together. She joined a book club. She laughed more, loudly, freely. She started dating again, slowly, with care, no rushing, no illusions, only honesty. One afternoon, while painting in her studio, she caught her reflection in the window. She looked peaceful. Not invincible, not untouched, but whole. That's what healing gave her, not the power to forget but the grace to remember without breaking. She thought about trust often, not as blind faith but as a dialogue between heart and mind. She knew now, love without awareness is not love, it's surrender, and her peace was too precious to trade for anyone else's comfort. The pain Michael caused her had been real, but so was her recovery, and in that she found her purpose. She began mentoring young women in her industry. She told them, trust your instincts, ask the hard questions, and if someone makes you feel smaller, dimmer, quieter, walk away. That's not love. They listened. Because Sophie no longer just survived, she led. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the Berlin skyline, casting gold across the wooden floors of her new home, Sophie lit a candle, not for grief, not for closure, but for gratitude. For the woman she'd become, for the life she was shaping, and for the truth she now carried like armor. Your peace is worth more than any illusion of love. Sometimes, strangers wrote to her after reading her anonymous blog. Some had lived through similar betrayals. Others were still trapped, unsure if their fears were real. Sophie didn't offer easy answers. Instead, she shared what helped her: journaling, therapy, building routines, surrounding herself with people who honored her voice. One message stayed with her. A young woman had written, "You made me believe I can leave, that I deserve better." Sophie read it twice, then a third time. Then she cried, not from sadness but from the quiet power of knowing that her story, once filled with fear, had become someone else's courage. She printed that message and taped it above her desk. It reminded her even broken pieces can build something strong. Even silence, once shattered, can sing again. So she kept writing, painting, mentoring, not to relive the past, but to remind herself that healing wasn't a finish line. It was a choice she made every day, one breath at a time. One boundary, one brave no, one brave black no before joining the show again, and when she pushed the button, no more pain, no more brave no. And with each step forward, she carried her truth like a torch. Your peace is worth more than any illusion of love.